Hashirama was the first Shinju. And while that might seem completely ludicrous to you, this concept that somehow, someway, Hashirama was a divine tree like the Shinju we're currently seeing in Boruto, the more we get to learn about these divine trees, the more it's undeniable that they have a mysterious amount of similarities with the first Hokage. And Chapter 27 truly drove that point home. See, Wood Release is often talked about as one of not only the most powerful jutsus of all time, but also one of the most difficult to master and or replicate. So much so that basically anybody who's ever been able to use Wood Release who was not named Hashirama had to take some of his body and graft it onto theirs. And even those who were successful in replicating Wood Release on themselves by grafting Hashirama's cells onto their bodies, or those who were naturally born with the affinity to use Wood Release like Moegi, have never been able to achieve the level of Wood Release that Hashirama was capable of. In fact, the Wood Release that they were able to use is so much weaker that honestly calling it Wood Release is kind of an insult to what Hashirama was pulling off, as by far and away the most impressive user of Wood Release outside of Hashirama was obviously Madara, who was not only able to take Hashirama's Wood Release, but also replicate his Sage Mode by sucking it out of his Edo Tensei body. However, in Boruto, a character has emerged that seemingly has a level of control over Wood Release on par with that of Hashirama, and that character would be Jura. But Nick, of course Jura is incredible at Wood Release. I mean, after all, he is literally a living, breathing, walking, and talking divine tree. If anybody was going to be able to control Wood Release, it would be the sentient tree. However, the more we learn about how Jura uses Wood Release and how his Wood Release ties back to the divine tree, the more we can use that information to figure out the enigma that Hashirama was. See, because while learning more about Jura and his Wood Release allows us to better understand Hashirama and his, it also allows us to better understand all of Hashirama's abilities, not just his Wood Release. Thus today I want to use this new information to dive deep into one of the most iconic characters from Naruto's past, the first Hokage. Because today we're talking we were wrong about Hashirama. But before we get to diving into what we were wrong and right about, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're looking for one additional NC Hammer 23 video every single week, you guys can go ahead and find my Naruto reaction series using the fourth wall link in my description below. We're on to Naruto versus Kiba. But before we get into all that today, I want to talk to you about our favorite recurring sponsor to the page, HelloFresh. HelloFresh wants you to know that they are now better than ever. See, because while HelloFresh has always prided themselves on allowing you to skip the grocery store and delivering seasonal and delicious ingredients to your doorstep every single week, they have now doubled their menu size. And if that level of variancy isn't enough for you, they also allow you to swap out the proteins and veggies that come in every single meal for all my picky eaters out there. On top of that, HelloFresh wants to make sure that when you're done cooking their recipes, you're full, which is why they've increased their portion sizes. They've also made a commitment to adding more veggies into their recipes. On top of that, they want to make sure that you're really getting any protein you want at no additional cost, which is why you can now add seafood and premium steak at no additional cost to your existing recipes. Some nights we don't even have the time to cook a meal for ourselves, which is why HelloFresh now has the option to provide heat and eat meals that are ready in just 3 minutes. But there's a big difference between telling and showing, so let's head down to the kitchen and cook ourselves up a little dinner. For those of you afraid making HelloFresh meals is going to take too much time, they always have options that allow for you to get done cooking and get to eating real quick. All you have to prep is your ginger, your garlic, and then split up your greens and your whites of your scallions. I also have to cut these wonton papers into quarters. Cook up the pork in the provided sesame oil. Add in the garlic, ginger, whites of the scallions, and some carrots. We then add 5 cups of water and all the stock concentrates that were provided and let it boil. We then drop in our wonton triangles, one-ish at a time. We added in some bok choy. We sprinkle in some green onions for additional flavor. Sprinkle on some wonton crisps here for a little bit of crunch. All that's left now is to dig in. So hot, but delicious. So what are you waiting for? Take advantage of the new HelloFresh by using my code NCHammer23FM at HelloFresh.com for 10 free meals, plus free breakfast for life. 1 free meal per box with active subscription. Free meals applied as a discount on the first box. New or returning subscribers only, varies by plan. Sign up today. Click the link in my description below or use code NCHammer23FM at HelloFresh.com. See, like I already said, the more you look into it, the more you begin to see undeniable similarities between Jura and Hashirama. Hashirama, which seems absurd to say because one is essentially the Ten Tails but also a living divine tree, and the other is a reincarnation of Asura, a former head of the Senju clan and the first Hokage. However, we're not talking about the similarities between their backstories, but rather their abilities. And the similarities between their abilities became all but undeniable in Chapter 27 of Two Blue Vortex. See, because in Chapter 27, when Amado and Kawaki are reviewing Kawaki's battle against Jura using Kawaki's eye videotapes that are apparently stored locally on Amado's hard drives or something. I don't know, maybe they're uploaded to some kind of chakra cloud. I have no idea. Anyways, while they're watching back the fight, it's established by Amado in a warning to Kawaki that Jura is all but invincible. Not only because his wood release can operate as a perfect shield against any kind of offensive attack, but also because seemingly Jura is tapped into the energy of this wood release. And the idea of Jura being tapped into the energy pulled out by his wood release is kind of insane, because Amado establishes that the wood release that Jura is using is actually the roots of the divine tree, a theory that, mind you, we crafted up months ago. But this idea of Jura being tapped into the energy drawn out by the divine tree roots not only confirms that our theory that the reason that wood release works everywhere, even where there is not forests or roots, is because all wood release is actually tapping into the divine tree roots that run throughout the entire globe, because multiple divine trees have been planted on Earth, but also very much solidifies what Amado is talking about, that Jura, so long as he has access to the power of these divine tree roots, may very well be invincible. As if he's able to control the nature energy flow through these roots into himself, he is essentially tapping into the nature energy of the entire planet, and thus fighting against Jura is kind of like fighting against the entirety of the Naruto globe. And this idea that Jura is essentially powered by the planet works so well in Boruto. See, because it's been established that Boruto's iconic jutsu, the Rasengan Uzahiko, taps into the planet's energy, which has been established to not be nature energy, but also the rotational and centrifugal forces of a spinning globe. And therefore, if Boruto and Jura are supposed to be enemies we believe them to be, their battle would essentially represent the nature energy of the planet versus the rotational forces of a planet colliding. Two separate entities tapping into two very different energy sources from the same globe. On top of that, if we are assuming that Jura is powered by the nature energy of the planet, and that nature energy is at least somewhat similar to the planet's chakra, or planet's energy, whatever Boruto is tapping into, then that explains why Jura was able to immediately deduce what was happening to him when he was hit by Rasengan Uzahiko from Boruto, and all but immediately dispel it from his body, because Boruto was trying to use an energy source that Jura's very familiar with against Jura. But therefore, as we watch this uniquely powerful entity with a hands-free healing factor, a ridiculous chakra pool, and some of the highest level wood release we've ever seen, I can't help but be reminded of Hashirama. And this possible connection between these two very disconnected characters not only helps explain Jura's origins, but also maybe Hashirama's. See, because while we do know a fair amount about Hashirama, probably more than we know about any other character who was never alive during Naruto's lifetime, there are still parts of his life that are gigantic blank spots. And most of those gigantic blank spots are explanations on how he got his myriad of ridiculous abilities. See, if I ask you why Hashirama has such a ridiculously large chakra pool, or why Hashirama had a naturally occurring healing factor that he didn't even need to weave hand signs to activate, the majority of you would probably say, oh, it was because he was a Senju, or oh, because he was Asura's reincarnation, and neither of those answers are technically wrong. And yes, basically everything we've ever heard in terms of an explanation for why Hashirama was the way that he was because he was the strongest Senju of his time. The Senju were known for their overflowing amount of chakra, which is further proved by the point that the Senju were claimed to be closely related to the Uzumaki, who were also known for their ridiculous life forces, so much so that simply biting some Uzumaki like Karin was enough to heal people from deadly wounds. And therefore this idea that Hashirama was overflowing with chakra and was able to heal himself without any input on his end seems to tie into the idea that he was a Senju. I mean, if the Uzumaki can do it, why couldn't the Senju if they were closely related to the Uzumaki? However, unfortunately, this idea that Hashirama's powers are tied back to the Senju, or the fact that he's an Asura reincarnation, aren't necessarily verifiably provable. See, we've seen a lot of very powerful Senju. Tsunade, Tobirama, Hashirama's father, Bootsuma, I believe. However, Hashirama is the only one out of all of those ridiculously powerful Senju who has this naturally occurring healing factor. And while Tsunade is able to achieve that same level of healing factor using her Strength of 100 Seal, the Strength of 100 Seal is a jutsu that possibly ties its roots back all the way to Kaguya, but more likely than not, Mito and the Uzumaki. And that's more about sealing a little bit of chakra away every single day so you can access that chakra in emergency situations later on. I mean, even Madara himself says that Tsunade's Strength of 100 regeneration pales in comparison to that of Hashirama's. On top of this, it seems as though being Asura's reincarnation doesn't necessarily confer you any kind of healing factor, confirmed by the fact that the second that Kurama is pulled out of Naruto in the 4th Great Shinobi World War, he all but immediately dies, and time again it's displayed that Naruto doesn't get his healing factor until he taps into the power of Kurama, something that's proven as early as Naruto's battle against Haku. So if no other Asura reincarnation in the lineage of the ones that we know had a hands-free healing factor that wasn't tied to a tailed beast, and no other powerful Senju out of the much longer list of powerful Senju that we know had a hands-free healing factor, it seems kind of odd that the only answers we have to describe how Hashirama was able to have this ability that nobody else has are two possible explanations filled with other characters who did not have this ability. So it's not crazy for us to assume that Hashirama's healing factor came from his connection to the divine tree, because after all, the only person with a healing factor comparable to that of Hashirama's without the input of something else like tailed beast chakra or hand seals is Jura, who gets his healing factor from his connection to the divine tree. And here's the thing, if Hashirama does actually get his ridiculous healing factor from his connection to the divine tree, it not only explains why him and Jura both have this kind of crazy healing factor, but also explains why he had a massive chakra pool that was comparable to the combined chakra pool of Naruto and half of Kurama, ridiculous wood release, and a mysterious sage mode whose origins have never been explained, which is seemingly not tied to any sage animal like a toad, a slug, or a snake. It would also explain why any and all attempts, even by the most genius people on Earth, to recreate wood release have either been abject failures or created results that simply don't live up to the level that Hashirama had. See, because by far and away, the most successful attempts to replicate Hashirama's wood release have been Zetsu and Yamato. Now, I know I said earlier that the most successful replication of Hashirama's wood release ever was Madara, and that is still true, but Madara basically just became Hashirama. It's not even a replication. He stole his cells, grew his face on his chest, and then stole his sage mode. Not to mention that Madara himself was tapped into the Geto Mazo for decades. And as we all know, the Geto Mazo was the husk of the original Ten Tails, and Ten Tails are what turn into the divine tree. Tie all of this into the fact that Madara was also able to awake the Rinnegan by combining the chakra of Asura and Indra, and by the time that he was stealing Hashirama's wood release, he was well on his way to being Otsutsuki. And that's the thing. Time and time again, the best replications of wood release we've ever seen are either from the Otsutsuki or from Otsutsuki adjacent characters. See, because when it comes down to it, Yamato actually doesn't become a high-level wood release user until he's completely enveloped in a white Zetsu and made to be Tobi. A Tobi that battles against Mei, Inoki, and I believe Tsunade, or maybe A. I don't remember exactly who fights him. But this iteration of Tobi, which is just Yamato being piloted by a white Zetsu, is able to pull off a diluted version of the true 1000 hands. The Sage Mode jutsu that Hashirama was able to use to punch a Susanoo off Kurama, and probably the highest level wood release we've ever seen from a human. But it's not like Yamato would have been able to pull off this feat by himself. It's only because Yamato's powers were being used in conjunction with the powers of a white Zetsu that this level of wood release was able to be achieved. Now, this is obviously because not only were the white Zetsu created from Hashirama's cells, but also because they were created using the power of the divine tree. And thus there are these constant connections all throughout Naruto between Hashirama and the divine tree, which begs the question that if all of this is true, how did Hashirama get his connection to the divine tree? Sure, we can sit here and say that Hashirama, just like Juro, was able to control the roots of previous divine trees that had spread throughout all the globe, but why was Hashirama able to do it? Was it simply because he was an Asura reincarnation? No, probably not. Because if that was the metric, then previous reincarnations of Asura probably would have been able to do it at some point, and maybe even Naruto would have been able to do it, but Naruto, even with a Hashirama cell arm, has never even tried wood release. And honestly, I don't super have an answer here. See, the best answer I can think of kind of ties Hashirama to the cyborgs from Boruto. See, we understand that Amato, by using the cells of Shibai, was able to implant Shinjutsu in the majority of the cyborgs he created. Kashin Koji got the 10 paths, Daemon got Reflect, and Ada got Omnipotence. roots. While Code, and therefore by extension all of the Shinju, got claw marks. And therefore, if I honestly had to give you an answer on how Hashirama was able to achieve a level of wood release that is comparable to a divine tree controlling the roots of previous divine trees, I would say somehow, some way, he gained access to the powers of Shibai. I mean, after all, we've hypothesized for a long time that not only did Shibai create the divine tree that Kaguya said she descended down to Earth to harvest, but also that the chakra fruit yielded by that divine tree was enough to allow Shibai to shed his corporeal form and go on to be a big old god living in his own dimension, and therefore Shibai's body still existed under the divine tree that Kaguya ate the fruit of. You know, the one that gave her chakra that she consumed after humanity turned against her. And therefore it stands to reason that if Shibai created the first divine tree, the one that Kaguya came to Earth for, that he, like Madara when he created a divine tree during the Fourth Great Shinobi World War, had complete and total control over this divine tree. That is to say that he grew the roots all throughout Earth that still exist today. Because mind you, that's how a divine tree works. A 10 tails is given a lower ranking Otsutsuki to consume, and then that divine tree shoots its roots into the ground, and the person who made the divine tree controls the roots to wrap up every single entity on Earth, or whatever planet they're on, and sap out all of their chakra to feed the divine tree, creating a chakra fruit. And therefore accessing the powers of these divine tree roots that were initially controlled by Shibai is essentially accessing the power of Shibai, or any Otsutsuki that's ever planted a divine tree that was able to consume the power of an entire globe. And Jura, as a living version of this divine tree, is a living testament to its powers, and therefore anybody who displays similar powers to Jura probably has some kind of connection to the divine tree roots that run all throughout the globe, and therefore the Otsutsuki, and more likely than not, Shibai. And I mean, think about it. Not only has Hashirama been able to pull off things like Deep Forest Emergence, Sage Art True 1000 Hands, and Wood Dome so incredibly powerful they can deflect tailed beast bombs, but he also had a Sage mode that is seemingly connected to nothing, and therefore those who hypothesize that Hashirama was actually a tree sage might not have been wrong. But rather than being a tree sage, Hashirama was a divine tree sage. And this idea of connecting Hashirama, at least mentally, to the cyborgs works out really well when you think about the origins of wood release in the Naruto universe. Because, like we said, if it has now been established that all wood release is controlling the divine tree roots, Hashirama, while he was the most powerful wood release user we've ever seen amongst humans, cannot use wood release at the same level of people like Shibai or Madara or Kaguya. See, because, well, yes, he can pull off Deep Forest Emergence and Sage Art True 1000 Hands, the highest level of wood release we've ever seen is capturing everybody on Earth simultaneously with the roots of a divine tree to suck out their chakra to create a chakra fruit. A level of feat we never even saw Hashirama sniff at. Now, obviously, Hashirama never wanted to do that, so we can't necessarily confirm as to whether or not he would have been able to, but it's safe to assume that he probably couldn't have. And because Hashirama probably couldn't have, that puts him perfectly in line with the majority of the cyborgs who have had successful implantations of Shinjutsu. Take Ada, for example. While yes, she does technically have the ability to use omnipotence, she is A, not able to control it, and B, is only able to use it subconsciously. Whether that's getting everybody that she ever interfaces with to like her, or swapping Boruto and Kawaki's positions for everybody on Earth in a mere moment. Yes, Ada has access to the programming language of the gods, but she's not able to use it like the gods. And therefore, if somehow, some way, Hashirama got access to, let's call it Divine Tree Sage mode, something that would not only allow him to tap into the nature energy of the planet without a connection to an animal, but also infinitely boost his healing factor and gain access to a ridiculous level of wood release, he still would not be using it on par with the gods who were born with access to that Shinjutsu. Or, well, maybe not born with access, but gain access to it after consuming a chakra fruit. Well, actually, not after consuming a chakra fruit, like in order to create a chakra fruit, but still, you get it. And thus, Hashirama may not just be a mysterious blank Sage mode user who had access to the highest level of wood release for no real reason, but in actuality might have been the first Shinjutsu user we've ever seen. And therefore, his access to a ridiculously powerful yet still diluted version of the Shinjutsu was enough to allow him to round up all the tailed beasts, which obviously wood release would be effective for if Hashirama was actually controlling the roots of the divine tree, because the roots of the divine tree came from the power of the 10 tails. And thus Hashirama, when he was rounding up all 9 of the tailed beasts, was essentially not only using the power of a tree that is meant to absorb chakra, but also the power of a tree that came from the origin of the tailed beast power themselves. And after rounding up all those tailed beasts, Hashirama was so powerful with this watered down Shinjutsu that he was able to unify the entire Land of Fire, starting the Hidden Village era. And listen, while this concept might sound ridiculous, it basically answers all of the lingering questions we have about one of the most important historical figures in the Naruto universe. So was Hashirama a Shinju? No, not really. Was he a cyborg? Also no, not really. But did his powers tie him to the divine tree in some mysterious way? Yeah, I believe so. But as to how, I can't say. How do you guys think Hashirama gained this connection to the power of the divine tree? Let me know in the comments below. And while it goes down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. I got a real doggy Bjorn for Kitty Softpaws because she's the only one we have left. All of the other puppies have been adopted or gone to different foster homes, and they're all gonna be adopted soon. And Kitty Softpaws is going to my mom to go live on 5 acres of land in New Hampshire.